Another interesting aspect of the way personal data can be used in disadvantageous ways is the business of criminal data and humiliation. Here's a company that I profile in my book called BustedMugshots.com. This started out as a magazine in Austin, Texas. Every week they would publish photos of people who had been arrested. And you could buy this at gas stations and convenience stores. He eventually went online, and he put these photos up for millions of people across the United States. He would code them so when you looked through a search site, you would find these names very prominently. And then he offered, for the convenience service of $100 or so, he would remove the photo after it had already been posted. Now, here's a story that I tell in my book, which is of Paula Roy, a citizen of South Florida. One day she went to lunch with a friend. She had already eaten, it was mid-afternoon, so she ordered the small portion of lentils. When the time the bill came, they charged her for the large portion of lentils. The amount of difference was $3.36. She argued about it and said, no, I ordered the small portion, I'll pay for the small portion. The restaurant said, no, you have to pay for the large portion. She left the exact change on the table for the small portion, and she left the restaurant. The restaurant called the police on her. She was arrested and sent to jail, where she spent 5 or 6 hours. She was photographed and released after that. The charges were very quickly dropped. The episode would have been quickly forgotten, except that several years later, when she was looking for a job, a friend called her and said, have you looked yourself up recently on the internet? And to her horror, she discovered that she was on this site, BustedMugshots.com. So this is the example of the kind of impact that this personal data, this public data, can be used in ways that had not been anticipated when public laws were made decades ago in the United States. Here's the man who set up Busted Mugshots. This is Kyle Prahl, whose 6 mugshots of himself are published in my book. He himself was a former high school drug dealer and had other scrapes with the law. So interestingly, when you dig into some of these companies, you find they themselves have interesting pasts. Here's another variant of that. This is a site called My Ex Get Revenge. You can post your former lover's photos, and they can be compromising photos. And for the convenient price of $499, you can have that photo removed. Here's another kind of business that has evolved in recent years. These are people lookup sites. Here's one called InstantCheckmate.com that's been very successful in recent years. When you do a search on the internet, you may find these ads, and they say, look up the truth, much more, look up the arrest records of this person. And if you go to the site, they have very dramatic language. So you'll see here it says, please use caution when conducting a search to ensure all the information entered is accurate. Learning the truth about the history of your friends and family can be shocking, so please be cautious when using this tool. So this is the kind of promotional language, of course, then people are clicking on and spending $20 to get the data files about other people. This company, interestingly, itself was very secretive about who they were and what their background was, and they had someone speaking for the company whose name was Kristen Bright, and the only picture or reference I could find of her was this Yelp page. When I called her, I could never find her. When I tried to send emails, this person never responded, and I came to suspect that it was a false person. So through various databases using their same techniques on themselves, I wanted to look up the woman in this thumbnail-sized photograph and see how far could I get, how much could I find out about a single person just based on a thumbnail-sized photograph. This image led to a bigger photo, led to a series of other photos. This first one was a woman on a boat in a bikini. There was other photos, some of them were family photos. Some of them were sort of erotic in negligees and a few topless photos, but there was a real person. And eventually, through a lot of detective sleuthing work over a couple of weeks, I was able to actually find this woman and her husband. Her name was Anne, and the husband's name was Tom. And I wanted to ask them, well, did you work for this company? They said, no, we've never heard of this company. Her photo was put out there without our authorization. They also said the following when I talked to the husband. He said, back 10 years ago, when you put pictures up on the internet, there was total anonymity, but it's not like that anymore. You can see now you put up a picture on the internet, and you get a guy from Harvard calling you up on your cell phone. So we've talked a little bit yesterday, some of the speakers, about the tangled fog of privacy policies, which explain what companies actually do with our data. So here's the size of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, 272 words, And here's Zinch.com's privacy policy. That's an education-related website, 6,269 words. That's longer than some of the chapters in my book. So this is deliberately obscure language that does not help the consumer understand. And it's just very basic information you want to know. Do they supplement additional data about you when they're gathering data? Do they sell it or use it with other companies? A simple solution to that might be something like a nutrition label. So if people care, they can look up and find out basic things as you might on a nutrition label on the back of food, which is fairly common worldwide today. Now, in terms of how companies approach it, this cartoon sort of sums up some of the feelings. It says, your call may be monitored, your internet searches may be recorded, your email may be scanned, your whereabouts may be tracked, your credit card purchases may be analyzed, and your most intimate personal details may be accumulated in order to serve you better. And it sounds sort of like a joke, like, well, that's not really like it is. But then this summer I was traveling in Istanbul. Here's a desk at Turkish Airlines in the airport in Istanbul. And what caught my attention was a little device to the side of this counter. Here's a close-up of that image, which is a listening device. And then above the listening device, it says, just like we just saw in the cartoon, in order to improve our quality of service, your conversations are being recorded. So my findings in general are that there are many tremendous great things that are happening with this technology revolution. But similarly to the way that there have been advances in the past with cars or factories or other things, you realize there are side effects that had not been intended. And so it took decades for car manufacturers to institute seatbelts, and the lap seatbelt, and then the three-point seatbelt, and then the airbags, and so on. And it took a long time before factories started worrying about things like environmental controls, pollution measures, and so on. And I think we're at that point with some of the data practices of companies where good people motivated by logical business reasons are leading into areas that are worthy of discussion, as a number of people have mentioned yesterday. And that's why the work of what you all do is so important, because I think we're at this point where we need additional examination of it. So that's the quick overview I wanted to give you. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions. Should we spark questions out of the audience? Is there one?
Back there.
Yeah.
Thank you. A question for the Microsoft speaker. What is your plan B if your lawsuit in the Southern District of New York, and as it progresses up, fails?
It's a great question. So for everybody, what is the plan B if, and we don't think it's likely, but if the Supreme Court or Congress doesn't act to address the warrant case? The great advantage I think we have is we can offer our products in multiple ways. We can offer a public cloud service, we can offer on-premises service, and we can work through partners to offer a hybrid cloud environment. And so we certainly believe that the public cloud offers more advantages, and particularly around security and also innovation. Having said that, if push comes to shove, we'll adjust our business model accordingly to make sure that customers can have the real and reasonable expectations of control of their data where they reside.
May I ask you a question?
Sure.
So a year or two ago, Microsoft started advertising and promoting that it was more privacy-friendly than other companies. What have the results been of that campaign that you've noticed?
Well, I think we've seen a lot of promising returns, I would say, in our commercial business. I'd say that on the consumer business, we're still working at it. I think in some respects, most consumers do not understand the information you're communicating, and as a result, they're somewhat desensitized to it. But we're continuing to work with them and continuing to point it out. It's interesting. There's a great video you can get on YouTube, of all places, where they have people in a van and they have an interviewer in the street, and they come up on somebody, ask that person the name, and they do a search in the van, and they start coming up with personal information that they can find on the web, and not just in Facebook. It's all over the place. And people get incredibly freaked out when it's presented to them that way. Unfortunately, I think, in my home jurisdiction in the U.S., I think we see that a lot of consumers are incredibly desensitized to what actually is being collected, and has been collected, frankly, for years, even before the internet. So I think this is an area that we're spending a lot of time trying to give education, particularly around children and in schools, so that parents and educators can understand what's going on and make more informed decisions.
The reason why I find that interesting is that I'm convinced that over time, businesses that are not transparent about their data will suffer and lose business and lose customers. Because when you see these massive breaks where people did not expect the American retail chain Target to have so much information about them, and then when they lose tens of millions of files, or most recently, of course, JP Morgan Chase, if there are companies that are gathering a lot of personal data, it's not really transparent to people, and then there's some kind of breach, I think that will cost these businesses a lot of money.
Unfortunately, I worry that it's going to take a massive breach and massive changes or challenges before people get that. There's another interesting sidelight to that, though, I would point out. How many people are familiar with the app Snapchat? So Snapchat's a very interesting business model. What it does to do is replicate communications in the analog world. So you can send somebody a message. That message times out over time, so it doesn't store forever. Recently, there has been an app that actually saves those messages, and that app actually had a breach. And so people who were sending messages in Snapchat that they thought were going away were actually saved in this other app that was siphoning information off of that app. And so I think the environment gets incredibly complicated, and there are just enormous numbers of issues of how do we manage this where people, again, try to take information and save it.
Unfortunately, what you say about time, I think, is also interesting, that in the automobile example, there were many decades of accidents, and famous ones. The actor James Dean, I think it was 1955, he goes flying from his automobile to his death because he's not wearing a seatbelt, but it's only in the 1960s that the first seatbelts become mandatory in the United States. So I hope we don't have years and years of that.
I agree with that. Sir.
Thank both for your introduction. I was the frightening sort of examples Adam Tanner gave are exactly the sort of examples that we need for what I yesterday called a fierce public debate. Now, my question to you would be, this is happening probably not primarily dealt with by big companies who could be slashed for not being trustworthy in the way they handle data, but small companies or others. And I would really want to know what would be your first thing if you would be a data protection commissioner to do in order to prevent things like you have shown us to happen. What is the main the main point?
Well, there's two things. First, I encourage my readers, and I'm writing for a mass public, I have a whole appendix of things that if you, the individual, are concerned about directed advertising, about controlling your identity, controlling your privacy, here's measures you can proactively take. But ultimately, we need the help of those folks in this room to help influence their legislatures and countries to have rules to put that in force. Now, I mentioned, for example, the mugshot websites. So since there was first publicity about this, and I wrote up first about this about 2 years ago, there have been a number of U.S. states, have quite a number, maybe 24, have changed the rules and made it illegal to take payment to take down photos, mugshot photos, afterwards. There's been other legislation related to revenge porn or the posting of sensitive photos about a former lover. So there's certainly legislative means that can help people who are powerless. But you're right, a lot of these actors are smaller ones who can gain a bit of market share by doing things that are a bit more extreme. And so some of the bigger data brokers will disavow these people that are selling intimate medical details and intimate stuff. But at the same time, as I think women from the FTC pointed out yesterday, there's, documentary